Cindy also said as she removed items from the car, she tried in vain to get rid of the odor. She claims it never occurred to her that a body might have been in the car because George had told her there had been a bag of trash left in the trunk.
And I set the doll down, and I went and got a Clorox wipe and wiped the face and the hands. And the body is soft, so it smelled pretty bad. So I went and got some Febreze, and I sprayed the doll. Then I sprayed Febreze all through the car, thinking that that might help the odor. I sprayed the front and the back. I used pretty much a whole can of Febreze.
Was it decomposition to me? Yes.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello from Boulder, Colorado, and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic community in true crime. A friend and myself drove by the Anthony home on Hope Spring Drive in Orlando over the weekend, and we actually saw George Anthony. We'll talk about that later in this analysis. But George, as recently as this year, that's just 4 months ago this year, subjected himself to a polygraph. It just sort of feels like the Casey Anthony case is still has a mysterious aspect to it, still has some unanswered questions. And so in any event, Casey's father, a former cop, was asked during the polygraph, George, did you conceal Caylee's whereabouts?
Kind of pull it together.
I just was visualizing the woods at the mall. I'm sorry.
The what?
The woods where she was found.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
yes.
I'm sorry.
Okay, you're going to have to compartmentalize. Right now,
Okay.
as you sit here right now,
Hello.
did you conceal her whereabouts?
Did I conceal her whereabouts? I do not know where she was at.
Okay, so why are you struggling with that?
George does struggle to answer this question, ultimately saying he did not know where she was. But in my opinion, George wasn't entirely honest in dealing with this question. I'll explain why and what I mean in a moment. First, I want to deal with entering the fabric of the Anthony case. So before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. This will be the first in a series of about 5 or 6 episodes dealing with Into the Fabric, based on going to these actual places and looking at the situation currently, getting a fresh look at it, and also just seeing what insights come about as one reviews the case. Also, if you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, 6 years ago, in July and August 2018, I wrote 2 books on the Casey Anthony case, 2 books out of a planned pentalogy. I was going to write a total of 5 books, and I was well on my way into the 3rd book, titled The Veil of Tears, when the Chris Watts case happened. And then my research and writing was put indefinitely on hold. This year, as my plane descended over Orlando, I recognized from the air the fabric of the Anthony case. I could see the suburbs that I'd written about, the cookie-cutter neighborhoods, at least cookie-cutter from the air, and the triangles, rectangles, and circles of woods and ponds. That simplicity continued even after I picked up my vehicle and drove to the crime scene. I went straight from the airport to Hope Spring Drive and the woods on Suburban. It's barely 5 miles from the airport. And it is just, once again, a ridiculously short distance where Caylee was left, barely 1 minute drive from the Anthony home. Now, Caylee's disposal, when you visit the scene, is really in the most obvious place. When driving down Suburban Drive, Caylee's grave is exactly where you would expect it to be. As soon as the road kinks, it's right there. And it's also right beside the road. Also, the road runs into a dead end. It's certainly a dead end when the school opposite that disposal site is closed, such as over a weekend. It was completely dead when I was there, even though there's as I say, school directly across the road, while I was there for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, not a single car approached, right? While I was at the scene, not a single car passed by. Now, something else that surprised me, I'm not sure if I knew and forgot about it or didn't know to begin with, but I was surprised that the wooded area close to Caylee's grave is fenced off on the side of the road where it is on the one side, but also fenced off on the other side of the road. And so right where the grave is, the fence terminates, which makes it, again, a ridiculously obvious place to look. It's not like you would look in the woods all along that road. Immediately after the kink is a break in the woods, and that's where there's no fence, and that's where you would look, because that's where someone could go in. And so, it is essentially the first and only section near the Antoneum that has access to the woods from the road, hidden around the kink in the road. The distance of the disposal from the side of the road is also surprising. I mean, we all know it's something like a quarter of a mile, but the distance from the side of the road to the disposal site is also really, really not far. And I think what that indicates is whoever threw Caylee's little corpse away was very spooked, very conscious of this idea of if they spotted while she's doing it, she's going to be in big trouble. So someone stopped there, very quickly got out, disposed of the little body, and then got out of there. Now, the problem of the cadaver smell, if you think about almost all the pieces of the puzzle in the Anthony case are actually really simple. Bad smell in the vehicle, well, this meant human remains were in the vehicle for quite a long period. What to do about that? Well, simply park the vehicle next to a dumpster and have the smell of garbage sort of associated with the vehicle. Have the smell of garbage from a dumpster basically enter the vehicle by osmosis. And this is where I think you start getting a sense of how the Antonys think. A lot of it is through association, right? It may not make sense, but that is nevertheless what is going on. There was also, you may remember, a pathetic effort at putting some garbage in the luggage compartment to account for the terrible odor coming from it. Did Casey hope the clientele at Amscott might be tempted to steal the car? Because that would have solved quite a few problems had that happened. Because the parking bay she chose is also right next to a busy highway, that there was certainly a possibility of that. And while I was there, I noticed it's not terribly visible from businesses across the road. So if you parked your car and left, it's not as though it's sort of chock full of businesses that someone would notice you. Now, if we return to this question, was George concealing something in terms of the polygraph? I believe George, when he says he didn't know where Caylee was, I believe him. But I'm not sure it's true that he wasn't concealing anything. You may remember Cindy said during the 911 call, and she said it in no uncertain terms.
There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the car.
Cindy would later walk back this comment in court, but I wonder whether Cindy was repeating to the cops what George may have observed to her. As a former cop, he would have or should have known what a cadaver odor smelled like, and you heard him testifying in court, saying that he was sure that it was human decomposition. Obviously, with Caylee missing for a month and the cadaver odor, the obvious inference to draw was that the cadaver smell was Caylee, which it was, and that Caylee was dead, which she was. And that is exactly what George also testified to, that it was unavoidable to draw this inference. But then, during the 6-month search for Caylee, both George and Cindy seemed to believe Caylee was still alive, that she was still missing, that suddenly them being so convinced that it was the smell of human decomposition, suddenly that changed. Did they really believe it, or was it part of a defense strategy and an effort at self-preservation? It could be that Casey did convince them that Zanny was real, or that George really was concealing something. It could also be that thing where you don't want to believe something, and so you are tempted to believe something else. In any event, if George was concealing something, he would be concerned that this might show up on the polygraph. Again, as a former cop, he would know that what he did know might show up as guilty knowledge. Now, going back to the scene, has anyone photographed the gravesite from this angle? This is where you see the distance of the grave to the side of the road, and then also the proximity to the entrance to the school, almost diagonally opposite the school. Now, that brings us to the obvious reason why Caylee died. Now, there's an aspect to the Casey Anthony case that's very simple, and we know that the lies were easily, it was something one could easily see through, but it's also easy to underestimate this case as being everything being completely obvious. So there's a dimension to the case that's explicit, and then there's another dimension that's certainly tricky, and that is the family dynamics. And it's not just between Casey and her parents. It goes much further than that. But let's go back to the obvious reason Caylee died. Casey had nowhere to live. She didn't have a home of her own. If that aspect had been different, probably the situation would have been completely different as well. And I do think economic circumstances play a role in this whole story. Not just Casey's circumstances, but Cindy's. Not just Cindy's circumstances, but George's. And on and on and on. If Casey had nowhere to live, then that means there was no place for Caylee. Now, you might say that Caylee and Casey did have a place to stay with Cindy and George, but do you think Casey felt that way at the time? If she left Caylee with Cindy, which she did do quite often, then Cindy would want Casey home by a certain time, and because Cindy would have to go to work and so on and so on. And so from wherever she was, Casey would be sort of roped back in. So if Caylee stayed with Cindy, Cindy would maintain a hold over Casey. And so one way for this young adult to get rid of her mother's hold over her was to remove Caylee from that equation. Now, if you doubt whether the relationship between mother and daughter, that is Casey and Cindy, wasn't a big factor in this, think about the relationship between Casey and her parents then, it was estranged, and think about the relationship now. Do you remember when Cindy called the police? She called them 3 times, each time escalating her accusations against her daughter over and above the previous time. The first call was originally to accuse Casey of vehicular theft. So, Cindy was very willing to throw Casey under the bus. And then she was increasingly pushing the narrative about Caylee's disappearance, but obviously I think she was cautious there because I think she realized, well, this could have very serious implications, not just for Casey, but perhaps for themselves. And so the point is, one does have a sense of the mother's coercive control over her daughter. Now, according to the Denver Post, Casey Anthony tried to give her missing 3-year-old daughter, she actually wasn't 3, she was about 2 years and a couple of months. Casey actually wanted to give her daughter up for adoption before she was born, but Cindy wouldn't let her. That's according to legal documents. The Denver Post describes these documents painting the 22-year-old woman as a perplexed, scheming, and unbalanced person who repeatedly defended obvious lies in police reports. Who else repeatedly defended obvious lies? Going back to the article, the 400 pages released by prosecutors this week leave little hope that Caylee Marie Anthony will be found safe. Anthony says her daughter has been missing since June 9th, but she didn't report it until more than a month later. She faces charges of child neglect, obstruction, and making false statements. The documents include a poem Anthony wrote on July 7, 8 days before she reported her daughter missing. What is given can be taken away. Everyone lies. Everyone dies. Prosecutors have called her a person of interest in what is appearing to be a murder case. She was freed last week on $500,000 bail and is on home confinement awaiting trial. Despite searches using divers and cadaver dogs, police have been unable to locate the Orlando girl. Now, what's quite interesting with this is the efforts to search for Caylee. People were diving into lakes and so on. Were they sort of doing a grid search and basically clearing out the areas closest to the home in a systematic manner? Now, if the other thing that I think is quite interesting about this is the notion that this was a murder case. What do you think the jury thought about this? What do you think about this? Was it an accidental death or was it a murder? I think it was a murder. Now, I didn't say Caylee didn't have a home, but that Casey didn't have a home. And I think to understand this case, you have to understand Casey and where she was as a 22-year-old. Not a 22-year-old mom, but just a 22-year-old. Was what happened to Caylee really that different from an abortion that took place 2 years and some months too late? When she fell in love with Tony, there was a place for Casey, but not so much a place for Caylee. Effectively then, it was still back to the same deal, back to square one. Casey didn't have a place to stay while she had Caylee. So the solution seemed to be becoming increasingly clear. A permanent babysitter was going to be needed for Caylee to solve Casey's problem. The reality is it did solve Casey's problem, certainly for a while. She got what she wanted, certainly for that month that she was out of the custody of her parents, especially her mother. Now, what I find fascinating, horrifying, and disturbing about this case is the notion of where the destructive dynamic started. I don't think it started with Casey. It may have ended with Caylee, but where did it start? Did it start with Cindy and George or with their parents? Driving through the fabric of Hope Spring and Suburban Drive, it was impossible to shake off the creeping feeling, not of hope springing, but of hopelessness in Suburbia. Hopelessness for a single mom living with her bickering, indebted, helpless, hopeless, coercive parents. What does it mean to be coercive? It means relating to or using force or threats. Have you ever lived in that situation? It's particularly unpleasant. It's kind of like a living death. And what is the relationship today between Casey and her parents? Well, they are still estranged. And that, I think, shows you the damage that was done, not just in terms of this case and this crime, but in terms of Casey's upbringing and Casey's upbringing while she had a child. When we drove down Hope Spring Drive and found George Anthony in the garage with the garage door wide open and a big flag fluttering outside in the sunshine with the word welcome on it, it was sort of beckoning to us. And we were about to get out the vehicle to greet George. George pressed a button and the garage door rolled closed. And so you have this dichotomy, welcome, and the door's open, and yet when you then respond to it, the door closes. And so I think Hope Spring Drive for Casey Anthony was anything but. Thank you for listening. You guys can read my Treachery series of 2 books. I'll put a link to that in the description. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.